What if the most powerful blow to Meghan Markle's image didn't come from tabloids, but from her own black family? In a shocking video out of Georgia, Meghan's relatives are breaking years of silence, and what they're saying has stunned the internet. Forget the royal drama, forget Thomas Markle. This time, it's her black Southern roots calling her out. They claim she erased both sides of her family, only using her racial identity when it served her image. From tearful testimonies to childhood photos the world's never seen, this raw footage exposes the Duchess in a way no media outlet ever has. Stay with us, because what you're about to see changes everything. Before we continue, please hit the like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell for updates. Under the glaring heat of a southern Georgia afternoon, a cell phone camera flickered to life. It wasn't part of a Netflix production or a staged PR campaign. There were no stylists, no handlers, no rehearsed lines. Just raw emotion. The hands that held that phone trembled, not from nerves, but from the weight of years of silence. And within hours of uploading it online, the video had done what no royal scandal or media expose had ever achieved. It shattered the carefully crafted public image of Meghan Markle with the simple words of her own blood relatives. Not just a family feud, this was a reckoning. The footage didn't just trend, it detonated. Viral doesn't begin to describe it. It swept through timelines and comment threads like a wildfire. People didn't scroll past. They stopped. They watched. Again and again. Some in disbelief, others in anger, and many in unexpected recognition. Because what those relatives were saying pierced something deeper than gossip. It struck the nerve of authenticity, of identity, of who someone really is when the world isn't watching. Meghan Markle, the Duchess of Sussex, has long been a lightning rod for global attention. From her fairy tale wedding to Prince Harry, to the bombshell Oprah interview, to the dramatic royal exit and Netflix documentaries, she's been more than a celebrity. She's been a symbol of rebellion, of race, of womanhood, of struggle and triumph. But beneath that symbol was always a quieter question, one that rarely made headlines until now. What about the family left behind? This story doesn't begin in London or Los Angeles. It starts in Savannah, Georgia. In neighborhoods where people knew Meghan not as royalty, not as a headline, but as family. Cousins who shared meals with her, aunts who remembered her laugh, elders who whispered her name in prayers. These were not tabloid sources. These were not paparazzi plants. These were voices long kept silent until now. And what they revealed wasn't just personal, it was explosive. She didn't just ghost the white side, one cousin said with tears in her voice. She ghosted both sides. She only remembered we existed when it helped her brand. That quote hit the internet like a gunshot. Social media lit up. Commentators scrambled. Cultural critics and royal watchers began asking difficult questions. Had Meghan weaponized her racial identity? Had she distanced herself from her black Southern roots until it was politically useful to highlight them? What does it mean for someone who claims to fight for racial inclusion to allegedly abandon the very people who gave her that lineage? The video, posted on a seemingly inconspicuous Facebook page by a relative who claimed to have had enough, was far from polished. The lighting was uneven. The audio cracked. But it was real. Too real to ignore. A group of relatives gathered in what appeared to be a living room, surrounded by fading family portraits, shared their memories, their pain, and their truth. They spoke with broken voices and fierce hearts. They didn't want fame. They wanted recognition. They wanted the world to know they existed. In an age of image manipulation, where public figures can reinvent themselves with a single post, this was the opposite. This was a mirror being held up. And the reflection it cast wasn't one Meghan could easily walk away from. Many in the public had long accepted Meghan's narrative, that she was the outsider, the victim of systemic racism within the British monarchy, a biracial woman who had to fight twice as hard to be heard and respected. That version of Meghan resonated deeply with millions. But this new video added a crack to that mirror. It suggested that perhaps, in protecting herself from one form of exclusion, Meghan may have practiced another. That in trying to rise, she left others behind, not just by accident, but by design. And so began a cascade of reckonings. Think pieces flooded the digital landscape. Influencers posted emotional reactions. Some defended Meghan staunchly, accusing the family of jealousy, of chasing clout. But others weren't so sure. They started revisiting past interviews. They pulled up old footage. They asked, where were these relatives when Meghan was rising? Why had she never mentioned them in her carefully curated speeches about her black identity? There were no easy answers. only hard truths. Journalists and documentarians raced to Georgia. Microphones were thrust into the faces of family members who never imagined their personal pain would be dissected by global audiences. Yet they remained resolute. They weren't there to attack. They weren't trying to destroy. They were trying to be seen. One elderly aunt held up a photograph, dog-eared and sun-bleached, of a young Meghan sitting on a picnic blanket surrounded by cousins. "She was one of us," she said quietly. "We were proud when she made it." But she forgot. She forgot where she came from. That image, Meghan as a child, with black relatives she never publicly acknowledged, sparked debate that spanned continents. It wasn't just about family anymore. It was about representation, about honesty, about the complex intersections of race, fame, and authenticity. What does it mean to claim an identity if you erase the people who gave it to you? To many in the black community, Meghan had been a breakthrough. A biracial woman breaking barriers in one of the most historically white institutions on earth. But the Georgia family's allegations cast a long shadow. They asked whether Meghan's embrace of her blackness had come too late, only when it could no longer be ignored, and only when it served her public narrative. She wanted to be royal, not real, one younger cousin said in the clip. But we're the real part. The pain in their voices wasn't just about abandonment. It was about erasure, about being edited out of someone else's rise. And as those emotions poured onto screens around the world, millions of viewers found themselves asking, is this the cost of reinvention? And who gets to pay it? In response, Meghan's supporters fired back. They pointed to the relentless racism she'd endured from British tabloids. They argued she had every right to distance herself from toxic family members. They cited the father who sold her out for press and questioned the motives behind the Georgia relative's video. But even amid the defensive outcry, a seed had been planted. Doubt had entered the conversation. The myth had been touched. And Meghan herself? No official statement emerged in the hours following the video's explosion. No denial. No acknowledgement. Just silence. But sometimes, silence says more than words ever could. In homes across America and beyond, families sat together and watched the Georgia relative speak. Some nodded. Others cried. Many saw reflections of their own experiences, of family members who rose and never looked back, of generational hurt dressed as ambition. It was no longer just about Meghan. It was about identity, legacy, and the invisible cost of fame. This story isn't here to answer every question or deliver a final verdict. It's here to bring you inside a moment, one caught not on a red carpet but in a living room, one not choreographed for optics but born from desperation and truth. What happens when your success erases your past? What happens when the people who helped raise you are turned into ghosts? And what happens when those ghosts finally speak? This is the story of Meghan Markle's forgotten roots, of a family who refused to stay silent, and of a viral reckoning that may change how the world sees the Duchess of Sussex forever. It started with an upload, a simple click. No studio backing, no paid promotion, just a group of relatives from Georgia deciding they'd had enough. Enough of the silence, enough of the erasure, enough of watching someone they once loved and supported reframe her life as if they never existed. The video, just under 13 minutes in length, wasn't sleek or glossy. It was raw, unfiltered. And it cut deeper than any documentary ever could. The moment it hit the internet, it didn't just make waves, it triggered a cultural earthquake. The setting was modest. A dimly lit living room with floral curtains. A well-worn couch that had seen decades of family gatherings. Photos lined the walls, some tilted, some slightly faded. In the center sat an older woman, visibly nervous but steady, flanked by 3 younger relatives, all clearly family by their facial resemblance. One cousin held a phone mounted on a simple tripod. There was no script, no teleprompter, just emotion. The video opened with a blunt statement. We don't want to do this, but we have no choice. Meghan has erased us from her life, and now the world thinks we never mattered. That ends today. Within the first hour of posting, the clip had already been viewed thousands of times. Within 6 hours, it had reached hundreds of thousands, getting picked up by gossip blogs, Twitter threads, and YouTube commentary channels. The algorithm couldn't get enough of it. But more importantly, people couldn't look away. In the clip, each family member took turns recounting their history with Meghan. It wasn't a frenzied pile-on. It was almost mournful. One of the older cousins, speaking through tears, recalled birthdays they spent together. She used to come down here every summer. My mom would cook, and we'd all run around in the yard like normal kids. She wasn't Duchess Meghan. She was just Meg. That use of the nickname hit differently. It gave viewers a window into a version of Meghan the public had never seen. Not the polished activist, not the ex-royal, not the podcast host. Just Meg, the girl with skin knees and braids who played tag in the hot Georgia sun. Then came the shift. The tone darkened. The relatives began to speak of how things changed. One said, "We always supported her. We cheered when she made it on Suits. We cried happy tears when she married Harry. But when she stepped into that world, it's like we became invisible." Their testimonies weren't vague. They were specific. They named dates, family reunions, phone calls never returned, texts left unread, and holidays spent wondering why the invitation stopped coming. One relative pulled out a stack of printed emails, some from over a decade ago. "I tried to reach out to her when she was in Toronto. I just wanted to see how she was doing." No reply. Not once. What made the video especially jarring was the absence of venom. These weren't people seeking revenge. They looked heartbroken. One said, "We're not perfect. Every family has drama. But we loved her. We still do. That's what hurts the most." Viewers were captivated. This wasn't just about Meghan anymore. It was about authenticity, about roots, about how far someone can run from their past before it finally catches up. Comment sections exploded. Some users expressed anger at the family for airing dirty laundry. Others thanked them for their bravery, saying they had every right to share their truth. And then came the most damning statement of the video. A woman in her 30s, who identified herself as a second cousin, looked directly into the camera and said, "Everyone's talking about how Meghan distanced herself from her white family. But let's be clear, she distanced herself from her black family too. She didn't want to be associated with us until it benefited her image. She didn't just ghost her white side. She ghosted both sides." That line echoed across the internet. Dozens of influencers clipped that moment and reposted it with reactions ranging from shock to outrage. It was retweeted thousands of times. Some accused the cousin of jealousy. Others saw it as the moment Meghan's public image was irreparably cracked. For years, Meghan had spoken about being biracial, about navigating two worlds and never feeling fully accepted by either. That narrative resonated with many, but this video added a new layer, a suggestion that the rejection may not have been one-sided. One viral tweet summed it up. "It's one thing to say the world didn't accept you. It's another to erase your own people." Major media outlets picked up the story within 24 hours. Tabloids splashed the headline across their front pages. Cable news programs debated it. Panel shows brought in experts to weigh in. Even political commentators got involved, turning the clip into a debate about race, identity, and celebrity in America. And while the world buzzed, the family behind the clip remained silent. They didn't give interviews. They didn't go on talk shows. They had said what they needed to say, and perhaps that's what made the video even more powerful. It didn't feel like a stunt. It felt like truth. Viewers began dissecting every frame. They analyzed body language, background objects, and vocal tone. Some tried to fact-check the claims. Others cross-referenced the video with Meghan's public statements. A few even dug up archival footage of Meghan's early interviews to see if she had ever referenced this side of her family. The overwhelming discovery: she hadn't. Even in her most intimate public appearances, her podcast episodes, her magazine interviews, her Oprah tell-all, Meghan had spoken fondly of her mother, Doria Ragland, and at length about her estranged father, Thomas Markle. But there was almost nothing about her broader family, on either side. And now, the people who had lived those unspoken chapters were filling in the blanks. The clip didn't just go viral, it went international. In the United Kingdom, where Meghan's every move is still closely monitored by the British press, the reaction was swift. Pundits who had long criticized her seized the moment. "We were told Meghan was a victim of royal rejection," one British host sneered during a segment. "But now it appears she's been doing some rejecting of her own." Meanwhile, progressive commentators urged caution. "Let's not forget Meghan has endured horrific racism," one writer posted. But yes, these allegations deserve to be heard and unpacked. In the middle of it all stood Meghan. Or rather, the silence of Meghan. Not a single post. No interview. No rebuttal. And the absence was deafening. That vacuum left others to fill in the blanks. Journalists began reaching out to members of the Georgia family, most of whom refused to comment further. One source, speaking on condition of anonymity, said, "We're not interested in becoming celebrities. We just want her to acknowledge us. That's all. But the media storm refused to die down. Within a week, the video had been viewed over 10 million times. Reaction videos flooded YouTube. Debates lit up Clubhouse and Reddit. TikTok creators posted side-by-side comparisons of Meghan's public statements in the family's accounts. People didn't just want to gossip, they wanted answers. Some critics argued that the family should have handled it privately. Why post it online? They asked. But others pushed back hard. She went public with her pain. One supporter of the relatives tweeted, "Why can't they?" The cultural divide became impossible to ignore. At its heart, this wasn't just a story about Meghan Markle. It was about America. About race, class, success, and what's left behind when you finally make it. The clip became a kind of Rorschach test. People saw in it what they wanted to see. To some, it was a cautionary tale about fame and abandonment. To others, it was a calculated attack on a woman who had already endured too much. But regardless of the interpretation, one fact remained. The video had changed the narrative. Meghan's story, once so tightly controlled, was now fractured. There were voices that couldn't be edited out, faces that wouldn't remain blurred, and a truth that refused to stay buried. Before the world ever knew her as Meghan Markle, the actress, the Duchess, the voice of modern royalty, she was Rachel Meghan Markle, a child of California with roots stretching thousands of miles across the country into the deep American South. The name Markle often conjures images of her controversial white father, Thomas, but there is an entire side of Meghan's lineage that has remained largely unspoken, nearly invisible in her narrative. Her black Southern family. The ones who now, after years of silence, have stepped forward not in hatred, but in heartbreak. Who are they? Where did they come from? And why were they kept in the shadows? The answers lie in Savannah, Georgia, and the surrounding lowlands. Generations of African-American families who trace their lineage back to the post-slavery Reconstruction era. Meghan's maternal line, through her mother Doria Ragland, connects her not just to California's spiritual and socially conscious communities, but also to the Southern heritage of resilience, community, and family that defines so much of the Black American experience in the 20th century. To understand the weight of their recent viral revelations, one must go back before the cameras and crowns, back to dirt roads, Sunday sermons, and family barbecues in backyards lined with moss-covered trees. There lies the truth of a young girl once embraced by cousins, great-aunts, and uncles who remember her as inquisitive, kind, and bright-eyed. They used to call her Little Meggie, says one older cousin from Waycross, Georgia. She loved grits and buttered toast more than anything. She wasn't some stuck-up child. She was one of us. Through interviews, family records, photos, and memories passed down over decades, a picture begins to form of Meghan's Southern lineage. A lineage made up of teachers, postal workers, cooks, deacons, and midwives. People who never sought the spotlight, but whose lives helped shape the girl who would one day marry into royalty. At the center of this history is Doria Ragland's family, particularly her mother, Jeanette Arnold. Born in the 1920s in Cleveland County, North Carolina, Jeanette would later move with her husband to Georgia during the Great Migration, a time when millions of African-American families fled racial terror in the Deep South in search of economic opportunities and basic human dignity. Jeanette was known as a quiet woman of strong faith. She worked as a nurse's aide and later as a seamstress. Her life was hard, but not joyless. She believed in family unity, discipline, and making the most of what you had. Her home was often the site of impromptu family reunions, and it was in that setting that Meghan first encountered the rhythms of her Southern Black heritage. Hymns sung from memory, peach cobbler made from scratch, and life lessons passed down through stories whispered in the kitchen. Jeanette and her husband had 4 children, one of whom was Doria. Doria, born in 1956, inherited not only her mother's sharp cheekbones and calm presence but also her desire to chart her own path. She moved to Los Angeles in her youth, eventually embracing a bohemian lifestyle that blended yoga, mental health counseling, and Ada. But despite the West Coast setting, Doria never fully cut ties with her family back in Georgia. According to relatives, she brought Meghan to visit them several times during her childhood. These trips, though infrequent, were impactful. She loved going down to the corner store with the other kids, a second cousin recalled. She'd get candy and talk to everyone like she was grown. We knew she was special. She had a light. That light, however, would soon fade from their lives. As Meghan grew older and entered the world of Hollywood, her connections to her Georgia roots began to dwindle. What had once been casual phone calls turned into occasional texts, then into silence. By the time Meghan was making waves on Suits, many of her Southern relatives hadn't heard from her in years. Still, they watched from a distance, cheering her success, defending her from racist attacks, and praying for her protection. Many felt a sense of pride when Meghan began speaking publicly about her biracial identity and her experience navigating predominantly white spaces. They assumed, even in her distance, that her success was their success, that she hadn't forgotten. But then came the royal wedding. When the guest list was released, it sparked confusion and then pain. The only family member in attendance was Doria Ragland. Not a single cousin, not an aunt, not an uncle, no one from Georgia. For many, it was the clearest sign yet that they had been written out of her story. She invited Oprah, but not her own blood? Asked one cousin in the now viral clip. What did we do to deserve that? Their hurt wasn't about entitlement or jealousy. It was about being erased. About realizing that someone you once cradled in your lap has decided the world is better off thinking you never existed. To make matters worse, Meghan's public narrative seemed to lean into the idea that she came from a fractured family. She spoke of feeling alone, of having no one except her mother. The Georgia relatives were stunned. To them, that wasn't just inaccurate, it was a lie. We weren't strangers. We weren't distant cousins from across the world. We were family, said one woman who identified herself as Meghan's cousin through her maternal grandmother's side. She may not have had us in California every day, but we were never more than a phone call away. She chose silence. That silence became deafening as Meghan's star continued to rise. When she and Harry moved to the United States, some of the Georgia family members saw it as a potential bridge to reconnect. We thought, maybe now that she's out of the palace, she'll reach back, said another relative. But she didn't. It's like we never existed. For years, their pain remained private, shared only among one another during family gatherings or whispered in prayer circles. But when they saw Meghan's continued public embrace of Black identity, especially after George Floyd's death, when she began speaking more openly about systemic racism, something shifted. For many of them, it felt like a betrayal. Not because Meghan wasn't allowed to speak on those issues, but because she was doing so without acknowledging the people who had lived that struggle firsthand, her own family. She talked about being a Black woman in the spotlight. But what about the Black women who raised her? Who prayed for her? Who helped shape her? We were good enough to help raise her, but not good enough to be seen. It wasn't just the public omission. It was the private distance, the unanswered letters, the ignored birthdays, the funeral one relative says Meghan never acknowledged. One aunt recalled mailing a handwritten note to Meghan after her wedding, a blessing and a simple plea to stay connected. It never came back, not even a return to sender, just silence. Over time, the hurt hardened. And when the viral video was finally posted, it was not the result of a sudden outburst. It was the result of years of accumulated grief, confusion, and finally, acceptance. They were no longer waiting to be acknowledged. They were reclaiming their voice. As the media spotlight now turns toward these relatives, many are urging the public to look beyond the celebrity context. This is not just about a famous woman who went no contact with her family. This is about a broader cultural pattern of how Black success is often narrated through the erasure of humble beginnings, of how roots are trimmed for optics, of how entire communities are left in the dark while the spotlight shines elsewhere. The family's decision to speak publicly is not just about Meghan. It's about the thousands of Black families across America who watch their sons and daughters ascend social ladders, only to be treated as liabilities rather than legacies. Their message is simple. You don't have to carry us with you, but don't pretend we were never there. Even now, after the viral clip and the media frenzy, many in Meghan's Georgia family say they still love her. They still pray for her. They still hope she might one day call. But they no longer remain silent. Their story is now part of the record, etched in pixels and echoed in the hearts of those who've known the sting of being forgotten. In the global media landscape, Meghan Markle has been framed through many lenses: biracial pioneer, victim of systemic racism, royal rebel. But what's been left out of that story until now is a complex and painful reality that very few ever dared to examine. The erasure didn't stop with one side of her family. In fact, it seems it extended to both. While much of the public discourse has focused on her falling out with her white father, Thomas Markle, and his side of the family, Meghan's Black relatives, the ones rooted deeply in the Southern legacy of resilience, have now come forward to tell a far more unsettling truth. She ghosted them too. The concept of double erasure is not just about distancing oneself from toxic relatives. It's deeper. It's about crafting a public identity that conveniently ignores those who shaped your early life, especially when their visibility might not align with a carefully constructed brand. For Meghan, that brand has evolved over time, from Hollywood actress to royal dissenter to social justice advocate and global influencer. But behind the speeches, the photo ops, and the memoir-ready moments, her own family, black and white, watched from the sidelines, bewildered at how they had become invisible footnotes in a story they helped build. The Georgia relatives who spoke out didn't mince words when they said, she didn't just ghost her white side. She ghosted both sides. That statement alone flipped the entire narrative. Until that moment, the global conversation painted Meghan as someone who had to protect herself from the racism and emotional exploitation tied to her father's side of the family. Few questioned why the maternal side, particularly her black Southern kin, were also missing from her story. And now that question was impossible to ignore. To understand this erasure, one must consider the public persona Meghan began to craft after her engagement to Prince Harry. Overnight, she became the face of diversity in a centuries-old institution built on whiteness. She was lauded for representing change in the royal family. Entire editorials celebrated her as the bridge between tradition and progress, between whiteness and blackness. But if she truly symbolized that bridge, why were the black people who shared her blood left out of the image? The answer, according to her estranged relatives, is both strategic and painful. As one cousin said in the viral video, she knew the world was ready to rally behind a biracial Duchess who spoke out about racism. But she also knew that bringing us into the spotlight would make that story messy. We didn't fit the narrative. That narrative, as clean and powerful as it appeared, was built on a mission. A biracial woman rising through the ranks of a racist institution is undeniably compelling. But a biracial woman who also quietly cuts ties with the very people who gave her that identity, who refuses to even acknowledge them publicly, that adds a dimension of complexity that many media outlets chose to avoid. Meghan herself has often spoken of feeling like an outsider. In her Oprah interview, she spoke of the royal family's concern over how dark her baby's skin might be. She described her struggles to fit into British aristocracy and being denied help during a mental health crisis. These revelations were deeply human and resonated with millions. But the omission of her black Southern family raised an unsettling counterpoint. Had she also contributed to the very isolation she now spoke out against? When asked if Meghan had ever tried to reconnect over the years, several family members said no. One aunt recalled writing Meghan a heartfelt letter after the royal wedding, hoping to express both pride and forgiveness. She never received a response, not even a form letter from a handler. "I wanted her to know that we still saw her," the aunt said. "But I guess she didn't want to see us." The hurt, they emphasized, wasn't about missing out on royal perks. It was about erasure. About watching someone rise to international prominence and speak on behalf of a community she had seemingly abandoned in private. The relatives' stories echoed with pain but also with restraint. They weren't out to attack Meghan's character. They repeatedly acknowledged the difficulty of navigating the public eye, of enduring racist press, and of having one's every move scrutinized. But what they couldn't accept was being written out entirely. "It's one thing to protect your peace," said a cousin. "It's another to act like we never existed." This double erasure of both white and black roots creates a paradox in Meghan's public identity. In one breath, she is a champion of inclusion, speaking passionately about race, mental health, and empowerment. In the next, she is accused by her own family of constructing that identity atop the silence of those who raised her. The deeper question becomes, is authenticity possible when key parts of one's past are deliberately hidden? The media, for the most part, had gone along with Meghan's curated story. They painted Thomas Markle as the problematic parent, paparazzi-chasing, attention-seeking, and ultimately toxic. They elevated Doria Ragland as the quiet, dignified mother who stood alone in support. That version of events left little room for nuance, and no room at all for extended family. Until now. Once the Georgia family's testimony went viral, media outlets began to reevaluate. Why had there been no acknowledgement of these relatives before? Why had Meghan, so vocal about identity and heritage, never spoken of them, not even in passing? Some defenders argued that Meghan had the right to choose who stays in her life. that not all family is healthy. But those who watched the relatives speak saw something different. They saw vulnerability. They saw love. They saw confusion, not malice. One younger family member, barely out of his teens, tearfully described watching Meghan on television and feeling pride, but also sadness. "I used to tell my friends, that's my cousin. And they'd ask, why doesn't she talk about you? I didn't have an answer." That silence, multiplied across years and generations, eventually became too much to bear. From an identity standpoint, Meghan's decision to not include her Southern black family complicates the very narrative she's used to inspire others. It's not that she isn't biracial. It's not that her struggle wasn't real. It's that, in simplifying her story for mass consumption, she appears to have omitted key players who gave that story its foundation. In conversations about race, especially in the United States, the issue of respectability politics looms large. Many black families have watched as their more successful members distance themselves in order to be palatable to white society. The phenomenon is not new. What makes Meghan's case unique is the scale of her platform and the contrast between her public values and private choices. She has spoken movingly about the importance of speaking one's truth, of not letting others silence you, of embracing who you are. But the Georgia relatives video turned those affirmations inward. What happens when we speak our truth? What happens when we refuse to be silenced? The video made it clear they weren't chasing attention. They weren't asking for invitations to Frogmore Cottage. They wanted recognition, the dignity of being seen and named. Double erasure doesn't just hurt families, it fractures identity. It confuses the next generation, those trying to make sense of where they come from. And in Meghan's case, it invites a hard but necessary question. Can you truly claim a heritage you've left behind? As one relative said toward the end of the video, we're not trying to ruin her. We're trying to remind her of who she was, of who we are. For many viewers, that plea cut through the noise. It wasn't about Meghan's downfall. It was about accountability, about honesty, about reckoning with the uncomfortable parts of one's rise. Because the truth is, fame doesn't erase history. Success doesn't delete people. And carefully managed narratives can only last so long before reality forces its way through. Long before Meghan Markle became the Duchess of Sussex, she understood the power of perception. In Hollywood, image is everything. How you're seen can dictate the roles you're offered, the interviews you're invited to, and ultimately, how successful your career becomes. Meghan, like many in the industry, learned early on that shaping a compelling public identity wasn't just smart, it was essential. But as her life transitioned from minor celebrity to global figure, something far more intricate unfolded. The way she embraced her racial identity, spoke about family, and curated her backstory was not just about self-expression. It began to resemble strategy. Those who knew Meghan before the fame describe her as sharp, ambitious, and acutely aware of how she came across. In college, she was known for her poise. During her time as a briefcase model on Deal or No Deal, she made an impression not for being the loudest, but for being the most composed. Even then, friends say she spoke often about wanting to do more, act, yes, but also impact change. She wasn't content to be just another pretty face. But that ambition came with something else, a keen sense of branding. Unlike some celebrities who fall into their identities over time, Meghan actively built hers. And nowhere was this more evident than in her racial presentation. For much of her early public life, Meghan was known in Hollywood circles as ambiguous. Her skin tone, light enough to pass for Latina or Mediterranean, made her versatile in casting but also added a layer of invisibility to her black heritage. Casting directors often didn't know how to categorize her. And Meghan, in turn, often leaned into that ambiguity. Her early acting resume didn't emphasize race. Her first major role on the legal drama Suits featured her as Rachel Zane, a whip-smart paralegal with no clear racial backstory. It wasn't until years into her television career that Meghan began speaking openly about her experience as a biracial woman. And while this could be seen as a natural evolution of confidence, critics now suggest that it also aligned with a growing trend of socially conscious branding in Hollywood. By the time Meghan began dating Prince Harry, her racial identity was suddenly thrust into global headlines. The British press, never shy about race, began referencing her blackness almost immediately, often in subtle, coded language. Headlines referred to her exotic DNA and straight-outta Compton background, even though she grew up in a middle-class Los Angeles neighborhood. The tone was unmistakable. The message was clear. She was different. That moment, when her relationship with Prince Harry went public, became a turning point. Meghan, now faced with worldwide attention and scrutiny, began to shift her image again. No longer simply the actress trying to break into more serious roles, she became a symbol. A biracial woman entering the most famously white institution on earth, the British monarchy. She began giving interviews that focused more on her heritage, her struggles, and her sense of identity. She wrote an essay for Elle magazine titled, "I'm More Than an Other," which detailed her experience growing up mixed race. She began aligning herself with causes and charities that highlighted racial equality, diversity, and empowerment. Her brand was no longer just aspirational, it was revolutionary. But something was missing. For all the words she shared about being a woman of color, Meghan rarely, if ever, mentioned the black side of her family, particularly her maternal relatives from Georgia. There were no public references to childhood visits, no family photos from Southern cookouts, no stories of wisdom passed down from aunties and cousins. Her racial identity became part of her public persona, but her black family, those who embodied that identity, remained conspicuously absent. This gap, invisible to many at the time, has now come back into sharp focus in the wake of the Georgia family's viral video. Their claim wasn't that Meghan wasn't black. It wasn't even that she lied. It was that she used race as a tool, an asset when beneficial, an inconvenience when it didn't fit the storyline. And for those who feel erased, that's the deepest betrayal of all. A cousin in the video put it bluntly, "We never asked her to put us on TV. We just wanted her to say our names, to let the world know we mattered in her story." Instead, Meghan's public narrative became increasingly polished. In interviews, she spoke of growing up with a single mother, of being the target of racism, of overcoming the odds. And while these statements may all be true, they were incomplete. They left out the complex web of family that existed outside of her California life. The Southern traditions, the cousins and elders, the people who once braided her hair, fed her collard greens, and told her she was beautiful before the cameras ever did. This erasure became even more striking as Meghan leaned harder into activism. During the height of the Black Lives Matter movement, she gave powerful speeches about systemic oppression. She and Harry visited organizations dedicated to uplifting black youth. She signed on to projects aimed at combating racism in media. Her Netflix docuseries touched on the racism she endured in the UK. Yet, through it all, the question loomed: where was her family? In today's media landscape, representation matters. And Meghan represented so much to so many, particularly young women of color. She was a beacon of possibility. But the carefully curated nature of her representation, clean, polished, free from the perceived messiness of extended family, meant something else, that only certain versions of blackness were deemed acceptable. For her Georgia relatives, this felt like a slap in the face. "We were good enough to love her," one had said, "but not good enough to be loved in return." To them, the decision to go public wasn't about revenge. It was about truth. About reclaiming a place in a story that had shut them out. About forcing the world to ask uncomfortable questions about identity, success, and the price of upward mobility. And as their video continues to circulate, those questions have begun to surface in new ways. People are asking whether Meghan's embrace of her racial identity was genuine or calculated. Whether her silence about her extended family was an act of self-protection or selective forgetting. Her defenders argue that Meghan, like anyone, has the right to choose her relationships. That family can be complicated, toxic, or painful. And they're right. But the Georgia relatives maintain they were never part of that toxicity. They were simply omitted. The strategic nature of Meghan's image management doesn't stop with race. It extends to her brand as a mother, a philanthropist, a wife, a survivor of mental health struggles. In every public appearance, there's a theme, a message, a moment designed to resonate. That's not unusual for public figures, but it does mean that when inconsistencies arise, they're magnified. Meghan's decision to speak out about royal mistreatment resonated globally, especially with women who felt silenced or unseen. But as more people learn about her estranged family's quiet existence in Georgia, a dissonance emerges. If her fight is for visibility, justice, and truth, why are the people who knew her first and best left entirely out of the picture? Some say this is just what fame requires, that to survive in the spotlight, you must prune your past. But others argue that true strength lies in embracing your roots, especially the complicated ones. Because if identity is only embraced when convenient, then is it ever truly authentic? As this controversy unfolds, Meghan remains silent. No public comment has been made about the Georgia relatives. No acknowledgement of their video. No interviews clarifying her side. And in that silence, the questions continue to grow louder. In a world that is constantly demanding more transparency from its icons, Meghan's carefully constructed image now stands at a crossroads. Will she continue down the path of tightly managed branding? Or will she finally confront the untold chapters of her story, the ones written in the voices of family she left behind? Thomas Markle is a name that elicits an immediate reaction. To many, he's the grumpy, tabloid-loving father who sold out his daughter for a few dollars and a headline. To others, he's the symbol of a bitter, estranged parent who just couldn't stay quiet. For years, Meghan's estranged relationship with her father has been a constant fixture in royal reporting, a saga told through leaked letters, staged paparazzi photos, and the painful revelation that he would not walk her down the aisle. Yet, beneath the surface of sensational headlines and public feuds lies a man whose complexity has largely been ignored. A man who, like Meghan's Georgia relatives, also claims to have been erased, cast out of her narrative in favor of a more polished, more sympathetic storyline. But Thomas Markle is not just a caricature. He is a former lighting director, an Emmy-winning professional who worked on popular television shows in the 1980s and 1990s. He is also a father who raised Meghan as a single parent during critical years of her childhood, investing not only his time and energy but his savings and dreams into her future. Despite his public missteps in recent years, there are chapters of his life and his relationship with Meghan that deserve a more nuanced examination. Long before the media circus, Thomas was known in industry circles as a skilled and respected technician. His work on shows like Married with Children earned him a solid career and a comfortable lifestyle. He lived in a modest but stable home in Los Angeles, drove an average car, and supported not just Meghan but also her mother, Doria Ragland, in their efforts to co-parent peacefully during the early years. By all accounts, Thomas doted on Meghan. He was the one who picked her up from school, helped her with homework, and encouraged her artistic pursuits. When she showed interest in acting, he nurtured that ambition. He pulled strings to get her on studio lots, introduced her to people in the industry, and paid for private school tuition and acting lessons. In Meghan's own words, written years before their fallout, she once said her father made every effort to give her a better life. On her now-defunct lifestyle blog, The Tig, she dedicated a heartfelt Father's Day post to him. He taught me how to write thank you notes, balance a checkbook, and understand the importance of hard work, she wrote. He invested in my future so that I could invest in myself. That version of Thomas, a supportive, if slightly overbearing, father, stood in stark contrast to the man the world came to know as the royal wedding approached. In the months leading up to the ceremony, Thomas's life became tabloid fodder. British newspapers dug into his financial troubles, his reclusive lifestyle in Rosarito, Mexico, and his strained relationship with Meghan. Then came the bombshell. Thomas had collaborated with paparazzi to stage photographs of himself reading royal family history books and getting fitted for a tuxedo. He later admitted to the setup, saying he did it to rehabilitate his image and deflect the negative press he was receiving. The fallout was swift and brutal. Meghan, already under intense scrutiny, was humiliated. Thomas, embarrassed and facing backlash, withdrew from attending the wedding altogether, citing health issues and stress. Prince Charles ended up walking Meghan down the aisle, and from that moment on, the relationship between father and daughter was publicly fractured. In her Oprah interview, Meghan spoke of betrayal. She said she had pleaded with her father to stop talking to the press, to protect her privacy, and to prioritize their relationship. He couldn't do that, she said, and that hurt. For many viewers, that was enough. Thomas Markle became the villain in the Meghan saga, a greedy, fame-hungry father who had lost his daughter because of his own selfish choices. But what the media often ignored was that the collapse of their relationship was not solely rooted in one mistake. According to Thomas, it was a slow, painful unraveling that began long before the royal engagement. He claims that as Meghan's fame grew, her contact with him dwindled. Phone calls became less frequent. Visits became rare. And by the time she was dating Prince Harry, Thomas says he no longer recognized the daughter he had once been so close to. In a rare interview shortly after the wedding, Thomas expressed remorse but also confusion. "I made a mistake, yes," he said, "but I didn't do anything criminal. I didn't hurt her. I wanted to be part of her life. I wanted to walk my daughter down the aisle, and I wasn't given that chance. Some might dismiss his words as manipulation, but others hear something else: grief. The grief of a father who has been permanently cut off from his child without a chance at redemption. What complicates the narrative further is that, like Meghan's Georgia relatives, Thomas has consistently claimed that the silence from Meghan wasn't just reactionary, it was deliberate. He has repeatedly said that he has reached out to her, written letters, left voicemails, and received nothing in return. And while Meghan has spoken of emotional boundaries and the importance of protecting her peace, the contrast between her forgiveness toward public institutions and her lack of reconciliation with family members continues to raise questions. In the years following her marriage, Meghan has spoken at length about healing, about the importance of mental health, and about breaking generational cycles. These are noble goals. But as more voices emerge from both sides of her family, suggesting they were erased rather than engaged, the question becomes, is this boundary setting, or is it strategic distancing? It's easy to dismiss Thomas Markle as a tabloid opportunist. He has, after all, given multiple paid interviews, leaked private letters, and collaborated with networks known for their sensationalism. But it's also true that many of these actions seem to stem not just from spite, but from desperation. He claims he was shut out with no explanation. That after years of supporting Meghan, he became an outsider in her life. That his attempts to explain himself publicly were born from the frustration of being ignored privately. And therein lies the tragedy of this part of the story. Thomas Markle is not blameless. His choices undeniably contributed to the breakdown of their relationship. But he is also not the cartoon villain that the public has been led to believe. He is, in many ways, a mirror of Meghan's Southern family, someone who once played a significant role in her life, only to be cut off without warning or closure. Even now, Thomas says he longs for reconciliation. In a recent interview, visibly older and weaker, he said, "I just want to see my grandchildren before I die. I want Meghan to know that I'm sorry. But I also want her to know that I never stopped loving her." For viewers and readers trying to piece together the real Meghan Markle, the Thomas Markle chapter cannot be ignored. It's messy, uncomfortable, and full of contradictions. But it's real. And if we're to hold public figures to standards of authenticity, then the full truth, including inconvenient family histories, must be acknowledged. Thomas Markle may never be fully redeemed in the court of public opinion. But perhaps he doesn't need to be. Perhaps it's enough to recognize that behind the headlines is a father who, however flawed, still mourns the loss of a daughter who once called him her hero. Before Meghan Markle became a Duchess, she was just another struggling actress trying to carve a space in one of the most competitive industries in the world, Hollywood. And like many who attempt the climb, she learned quickly that talent alone wasn't enough. Fame, real fame, required more than skill. It required a story, a brand, a filter, a version of the truth that was palatable, marketable, and compelling. In Meghan's case, the higher she rose, the more her image needed curation. That curation came at a cost. And the first thing to be sacrificed, according to family members on both sides, was them. When Meghan landed the role of Rachel Zane on Suits in 2011, it wasn't her first acting gig, but it was the one that finally gave her visibility. She was cast as intelligent, self-possessed, and independent, traits Meghan naturally embodied. Behind the scenes, colleagues described her as focused and disciplined, often staying after hours to run lines or fine-tune her performance. She wasn't a diva. She wasn't problematic. She was determined. But with success came distance. Not just geographical distance. Meghan was filming in Toronto, far from her family in California and the South, but emotional distance. According to relatives, this was the point where Meghan began slipping away. "We'd call, and it would go to voicemail," one cousin recalled. She'd text back, maybe, a week later, if at all. At first, the family excused it. They assumed she was busy. They chalked it up to the pressures of filming and the exhaustion of celebrity life. After all, they were proud of her. They wanted her to succeed. But what began as sporadic communication soon became total silence. She changed her number, one had said. No heads up. No email saying, "Hey, I've got a new phone." Nothing. It was like she disappeared. In retrospect, this period marked a turning point, not only in Meghan's career but in the recalibration of her public identity. With more eyes on her, she began to fine-tune the image she would present to the world. No longer just a biracial girl from LA with roots in Georgia and a complicated family tree, she began to shape herself into a symbol of elegance, multicultural modernity, and resilience. Hollywood, as insiders know, is an industry obsessed with narrative. Stars aren't just people, they're brands. And branding requires clarity. Complexity, especially when it comes to family, rarely sells. Agents, publicists, and image consultants often advise actors to streamline their stories. Keep things simple. Highlight the inspirational. Minimize the messy. For Meghan, that meant drawing a clean line around her past. She emphasized being raised by a strong single mother, which was true in many respects, but it subtly eliminated the people who had played supporting roles in that upbringing, namely, her father and extended family. She began giving interviews that hinted at isolation and hardship but left out the cousins who helped braid her hair, the aunts who sent her care packages, and the father who worked overtime to fund her education. What emerged was a tale of triumph, a woman who rose above challenges to find her voice and take her place on the world stage. That version of Meghan resonated. It worked. She began appearing on panels, doing interviews about gender equality, and building a personal brand that transcended her acting work. Even before she met Prince Harry, she was being courted by fashion brands, invited to speak at events, and treated as a voice of empowerment. But for her family, especially those watching from Savannah and Los Angeles, the image didn't match the reality. She talked about her mother, and that's great. Aunt Doria's a beautiful soul. But we were there too, said a cousin from Georgia. And to act like you raised yourself from scratch? That's just not the truth. Hollywood didn't create this pattern. It merely accelerated it. Meghan, like many actors, understood that the public is drawn to a clean origin story. Complicated family dynamics, particularly ones involving mixed-race heritage and blue-collar roots, don't always fit into the polished world of press junkets and red carpets. So instead of integrating her full story, she filtered it. Meghan's blog, The Tig, was an early example of this filtration. Stylish, aspirational, and filled with reflections on wine, travel, and self-empowerment, it painted the picture of a woman who had refined her edges. It was sincere, but also selective. The blog rarely mentioned her family, save for her mother. It gave readers a sense of intimacy without ever revealing the full scope of who Meghan was or where she came from. Even in her early interviews, when asked about her background, Meghan would speak abstractly about identity and struggle but rarely about names, places, or people. She made it sound like she was floating in the world, trying to find a home, one relative said. But she had a home. She had us. As Meghan transitioned into the public eye alongside Prince Harry, this filter became a full-blown wall. Royal life required an even greater level of image control. And while she publicly struggled with the constraints of the royal institution, behind the scenes, that same level of control extended to her narrative about her past. When the royal engagement was announced, reporters scrambled to learn more about Meghan's family. The British tabloids were especially vicious, uncovering every connection, every relative, every old photograph they could. And while much of the coverage was undeniably racist and cruel, some of it merely asked, why aren't these people part of her story? The answer was silence. No cousins at the wedding. No childhood friends from Savannah. No family tributes. Just Doria Ragland, poised and composed, sitting alone in the front row. It was a powerful image, but for many of Meghan's relatives, it was also a painful one. I cried watching the wedding, one aunt said. Not because I was happy, but because it was like we had died to her. The family didn't expect to be flown to London or paraded in front of cameras. What they hoped for, what they longed for, was ignored. But fame doesn't just distort relationships, it tests them. As Meghan's profile rose, the gulf between her and her past widened. The cousins she once laughed with became strangers. The aunts who prayed for her became ghosts. According to several sources, some relatives tried to reconnect after the wedding, hoping that the excitement had passed and the lines of communication might reopen. They sent cards, emails, even private social media messages. No response. And so, the silence calcified into something else, disappointment. In time, that disappointment transformed into resolve. When the Georgia relatives posted their viral video, they weren't just airing grievances, they were breaking the silence imposed by Meghan's ascent. They were pushing back against the idea that success requires abandonment, that fame justifies forgetting. And perhaps most painfully, they were trying to hold on to a version of Meghan that still felt real to them. A version that hadn't been filtered through stylists, scripts, or strategy. In Hollywood, fame is a transaction. You give the public a version of yourself, and in return, you get applause, power, and influence. But what happens when the cost of that transaction is your roots? That's the question now hovering over Meghan's public image. Her decision to leave the royal family, move to Montecito, and carve out a new path as a philanthropist and media mogul is admirable in many ways. She and Harry have spoken passionately about building a more honest, open life. But to the people left behind, honesty begins with acknowledgement, with memory, with truth. The Hollywood filter served Meghan well. It elevated her from obscurity to stardom. It protected her from scrutiny. It allowed her to control the narrative. But it also silenced the voices of those who knew her before she was a brand, those who loved her without a press release, those who watched her grow, stumble, and rise. Not on a screen, but in real life. As public interest in Meghan's story continues, and as new chapters unfold, the question of who gets to be part of that story remains. Will the past be restored, or will it remain hidden behind the curtain of fame? The video that sparked a firestorm across the internet was only 13 minutes long. It featured no celebrities, no polished interviews, no dramatic music, just a group of people in a living room. Real people, speaking from the heart, visibly pained, visibly tired. What they revealed in that short window of time, however, was enough to challenge the powerful narrative Meghan Markle has spent years building. But behind the viral clip was a much deeper story, one that could never fully be told in sound bites or reaction videos. To understand the emotional weight of the testimonies given by Meghan's Georgia relatives, one must unpack the words they chose, the stories they shared, and the decades of context that gave those stories meaning. These were not mere accusations. They were deeply personal accounts of love, confusion, hurt, and finally, disillusionment. The first speaker in the video was an older woman named Aunt Geneva, who identified herself as one of Meghan's great-aunts on her mother's side. Her presence alone was powerful. With short, graying hair and a tired voice, she looked directly at the camera and began with a sigh, not for performance, but because the pain she was about to relive clearly weighed on her. "I watched her when she was little," she said. "She'd come running in the yard with her little shoes, skinning her knees and crying for Doria. I'd scoop her up, clean her up, feed her sweet tea and cornbread. That was our baby." For Aunt Geneva, Meghan was not royalty. She was not a media icon. She was simply family, a child who brought joy to their gatherings, a girl whose laughter once echoed through their halls. Her recollections were not bitter. They were warm, fond even. But it was the warmth of someone remembering a loved one who vanished without saying goodbye. She used to sit on the floor and listen to us talk about civil rights, about marching, about how hard it was growing up black in this country, Geneva added. She knew where she came from. That's what hurts the most. She knew. Next to speak was a younger man, mid-30s, who identified himself as Darnell, a cousin Meghan used to play with during family reunions in Georgia. Darnell's voice carried more frustration than sadness. "I used to think maybe she forgot us. Maybe she was just too busy. But when I saw her start talking about how hard it is being black, and how she understands the struggle, man, I lost it. Because where was all that understanding when we were right here? Where was she when Grandma got sick? Where was she when Annie D passed? Nowhere." He leaned forward in his chair, visibly tense. "It ain't about money. We're not looking for a check. We're looking for acknowledgement. We're looking for her to say, 'These are my people.' Not to act like she grew up in some fantasy land where nobody but her mama mattered." Several other cousins echoed Darnell's words, speaking about specific moments that made them realize they had been cut off, birthdays unreturned, holiday texts left unread, funerals not attended. One woman named Lisa held up an old photograph. It showed Meghan as a child, sitting beside two other little girls with matching dresses, all three smiling broadly at the camera. "That's us," she said quietly. "That's me and Meg. We were best friends. We used to write letters when we weren't together. She'd draw pictures of Hollywood and say she was going to be a star. I believed her. I supported her. I cheered for her. But I didn't think she'd forget who we were." Lisa recounted trying to reach out during Meghan's time on Suits. "I sent her fan mail through the studio. Nothing. I found her email through a friend who worked on set. Sent her a message just saying congrats. I'm proud of you. Not even a thank you. Not even a who is this? Just silence." One of the most heartbreaking moments came from an older man who identified himself as Uncle Vernon. He had difficulty speaking due to a recent stroke, but his daughter helped him share his thoughts. He used to call her his angel, the daughter said. She'd come sit on his lap and ask him to tell stories about marching with Dr. King. She loved those stories. She loved him. Uncle Vernon, eyes full of tears, held up a scrapbook, pages filled with clippings, letters, and early school pictures of Meghan. His daughter turned the pages gently, showing a history that most people never knew existed. He kept everything, she said, because she meant everything. Then came the most searing testimony of all from a relative named Carla. She spoke with clarity, calmness, and pain. "You know what hurts the most?" she said, staring into the lens. "It's not that she didn't invite us to the wedding. It's that she didn't even lie about why. We weren't acknowledged. Not even a call. Not even a press statement saying, 'I wish my whole family could be here, but circumstances are complicated.' Just nothing. Like we were never real." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. She could have said anything. That we were too private. That we wanted to stay out of the spotlight. But she didn't. Because in her story, we don't exist. Carla went on to describe what it was like watching Meghan's Oprah interview. She spoke about pain, about being silenced, about not being seen. And I understood that. I really did. But then I realized she was doing the same thing to us. We were being erased while she talked about being erased. The testimonies continued, each one adding new depth to a story that had been flattened by the tabloids and ignored by mainstream coverage. One cousin described driving all night to attend a family reunion in Savannah years ago, only to learn that Meghan had visited the area weeks prior and never reached out. "She was down here, and we didn't even know." She posted on Instagram about being in Georgia, but didn't say a word to any of us. Others talked about watching their children ask why their famous cousin never spoke about them. My daughter asked me, "Mama, does Cousin Meg know me?" I didn't know what to say. Because the truth is, Meg don't know her anymore. She don't know any of us. Throughout the video, there was a recurring theme and not of hatred, but of heartbreak. These were not people trying to destroy Meghan. They were trying to understand her, trying to make sense of how someone they loved, supported, and believed in could shut the door so completely and never look back. Their tone was not accusatory. It was pleading. "We just want to be acknowledged," and Geneva repeated near the end. "We just want her to say, 'Yes, I have family in Georgia.'"